Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. This is my second time doing this, and I am excited. For one, for the people who normally sit in the front row of me giving a talk, I don't have to worry about spitting on someone because I do get kind of loud and crazy sometimes. So this is neat. However, this computer screen may not fare for the better. Um, I am excited to be part of this first International e-GRO webinar and to get a few minutes to share with you an area of expertise that I've been working in for about 10 years, and that's substrates. And substrates are something that we all as growers, as researchers, know the value of. And in the last 10 years, in my estimation, there's been more interest and concern and questions about not just how to improve traditional substrates, but also what's the buzz with all these new alternatives that are being presented. So as we go through today, I want to just start with, Brian, this isn't advancing. Hold on one second. I'm trying to get the presentation to advance. There we go. Okay, great. So just a general overview of what I'm going to refer to as just our traditional substrate components. Now, let me first address the concept of peat-free. And this is something that I know a lot about or hear a lot about on the research side, but a lot of growers, a lot of public gardens, a lot of independent consumers are wanting to know about what is this concept behind peat-free, what does that mean for us in horticulture. Well, this finally hit me after a few years of traveling, looking at European growing methods, looking at how we as growers and researchers in horticulture in the US grow. And here's something I want to present to you. We in the United States are already growing more peat-free than pretty much the rest of the world, because any of our mixes, especially on the retail side, are only about 50%, give or take a little bit of peat. The rest of the materials in our mixes are all non-peat-like materials. As on this slide you can see, whether it's pine bark, perlite, or coconut coir, in recent years, be it vermiculite, all of these non-peat materials. So really when we think about peat, we're looking at only about a 50 to 60% ratio. Now, with professional mixes, with greenhouse growers, of course, that percentage is much higher. We're looking at somewhere in the range of 70 to 80% peat. So there still is a valued interest in trying to reduce that percentage of peat. Now, there's two reasons why. One is what I think to be somewhat of a misconception and lack of knowledge of a lot of our consumers and public, is that the environmental issue of harvesting peat. Peat is, and by far, and will be, the greatest substrate material we have to grow plants. It's wonderful. The problem is some think that it's being harvested improperly, that there's environmental issues with doing that. So I'll tell you all, from my personal standpoint, I went up and visited the peat bogs in Canada, and I was overwhelmed with what these peat companies are doing to be as environmentally friendly and safe as possible in restoring these peat bogs. So I applaud our peat industry for that. The second main thing, other than the environmental aspect, is the cost. Transportation is and has been and will be the #1 cost restrictor or promoting factor for mixes. When you ship things for long distances, you increase the value or the expense of that. So more accurately, I think the need and the interest in alternatives is coming from cost savings, as well as for some people wanting to use more local products, and wood is the topic of today. So let me give you a little bit of background on use of pine tree substrates, whole tree substrates, clean chip residual. There are a lot of different terms to describe the use of fresh wood components. Now for us, this began in 2005 when I first started working on this. And again, this came at a time when people were starting to get concerned with peat supplies, when bark supplies, so could we start using fresh wood? And a little bit of background on that. Here's the three different terms that you may have heard when it comes to using fresh trees as a substrate component. Pine tree substrate, whole tree, a lot of work's been done at Auburn University, some wonderful work through the years. Clean chip residual is not using the entire tree, but instead the tops, the limbs, the parts of the tree that are not used for pulp or for lumber. So all three of these terms, if you will, all are still referring to fresh pine wood being used as a substrate. Now, in the early years, and in the past 2005 until 2010, 2011, most of the research done was to try to figure out the cultural parameters required to grow nursery or greenhouse crops in a 100% wood substrate. Now, the reasoning there is that if we could identify the major issues with what it takes to grow plants in fresh wood, then anything we use smaller than 100%, any ratio smaller than 100%, gets easier and easier and easier. All right. So currently, research is not focused on growing plants in 100% wood, but instead wood as a component. Wood as a component. And in my time here at NC State, the last 5 years, after working with Dr. Robert Wright at Virginia Tech on this initial project, since I've been here at NC State for 5 years, we've worked more on the processing. How can we control the processing of wood materials to yield a consistent and reliable end product that not just on the research side we can produce, but that growers or mixed manufacturers can also know exactly how to produce very specific components. All right. One of the big overall things that relies on good quality growing mix is a consistency in the components that make up that mix. So that's really what our focus is. So with processing breakthroughs, some by accident, some on purpose, that we've had, we've got a good idea about how we can better utilize these wood components. So here's just one photo I want to show you of what it's like to grow in 100% wood, and this was some poinsettias from several years of trials I did years ago, and compared to what you can also see some of the plants growing in a peat-like mix. But it's a very interesting material when you look at growing plants in 100% wood. This, however, is more traditionally how you're going to see wood being used today in our horticultural our production, and it's wood as a component. Because if you look at this particular photograph of this, what appears to be an ornamental kale growing in a container, you've got still peat as the base, but you've got wood blended with that peat, and we'll get back to this at the very end of my presentation, because I want to end looking at this photo again and kind of tying together a few of the points that I'll talk to you about in the next 20 minutes. All right, so let me first talk to you about how these products are made. First, I must say that with wood and using wood in mixes, we've got multiple purposes that we can use the wood for. All right, if you look at this particular photo, this is a fibrous wood material made from freshly harvested loblolly pine that was processed under a certain set of requirements and standard and protocols to yield this more fibrous material. Okay, this, for example, would be used in a perennial mix, bark-based mix, or if it was ground a little finer, could be used as a peat extender or an alternative peat-like material. I never say peat replacement, because peat itself can never be replaced. We can substitute it with something for equal growing quality, but we can never replace peat. Peat is a wonderful thing. Look at this other hammer mill product. This is the second product, if you will, and this is what we're really excited about. And you see the difference between the first photo I just showed you and this. All right, these are two different components made from fresh loblolly pine, but have yet different purposes. All right, the first can be used as an extender of peat, or it can be used as a perennial mix. This is solely made for use as an aggregate. All right, and one more slide over, I want to show you the top three materials in this photograph are different materials that we here at NC State are working to work on the processing of how to make these. The one on the far left is the aggregate, or the perlite replacement, which I'm going to spend most of the next 15 minutes talking to you about. The middle one is more of a peat extender, a fibrous material, and then the one on the far right is kind of a blended mix of fibers and particles that can be incorporated. Now, the bottom three photos on this slide are three other fresh wood materials that other companies here in the U.S., and then one on the far right is actually from Europe. But a lot of fresh wood components are being used. If you take a look at this photograph of about a dozen different wood samples that we're working on for different processing procedures, materials that are being sent to us by growers, by researchers who are interested in maybe using some wood components that they have access to. So there's a lot going on with different components. The main take-home message here: Wood is not wood is not wood. Components are not components are not components. So you really need to be specific if you're interested or if you're inquiring about using wood components. It has to be a specific component made for a specific purpose. All right. Here's a good example of the difference in the three wood components. In the left, we've got more of the aggregate. I call it blockular aggregate material. On the right, top right, you got the fibers, and then the bottom one is kind of a mix of the three. So those three are going to perform differently. So I want to take the next few minutes talking about the wood chips themselves, not the fibrous material, but the pine wood chips, and their specific use as an aggregate. Now, a couple of reasons for this. Brian Whipker and I actually had a graduate student finish just past May, and he focused his thesis on the cultural parameters around what a greenhouse grower would have to do, or what they should expect to have to do when replacing perlite for wood chips. Some of my previous work in 2011 and 12 showed that yes, you can grow plants in pine wood chips as an aggregate, but Garrett, the student, he answered the questions about liming, about fertility, about PGR efficacy, about toxicity, about timing, physical property changes, all of those things you need to know before you incorporate any new component into your mix. Now, why substitute perlite? For one, the cost. Ladies and gentlemen, perlite is the most expensive component in a greenhouse mix. Averaging, the national average is somewhere between $1.45.50 to $1.70 per cubic foot. You compare that to what the average cost of peat, good quality peat is, and you're looking about $1 per cubic foot. So perlite is extremely expensive. The other reason that perlite is just a nuisance is not just the cost, but the dust. And the nuisance caused by mixing it in and of itself is a problem. So let's take a look. Here is those pine wood chips that were created specifically as an aggregate, okay? And if any of you are interested in how those are made and the processing involved with making those chips, I can discuss that with you at another time. We don't have time today. I just want to talk to you about the end product and how that end product is used as an aggregate. So here you can see a direct comparison of the particle size of the wood chips versus the perlite, all right? We're very excited not to have fibers, not to have any splinters in this, and that allows it to blend with the peat very similar to how perlite does, without it bridging or without it gapping or blocking together. All right, on this photo, you've got an example of three different fractions. All right, on the far right that I just highlighted, you got the large grade peat, all right, large grade commercial perlite, excuse me. And then right below that are wood chips that we've created that have the same particle size. Right? On the far left side of the screen is the medium or the finer grade perlite, somewhere in the middle with a mix of large and small fines. And then right below it, we've created a pine wood chip that, again, has those same fractions of different particles, yielding the same physical properties. And then in the middle of this slide, we have the really fine grade, more of the plug flat or the propagation size perlite, and we have pine wood chips of those same particles. So we're able to produce these pine wood chips to mimic whatever size perlite that one may want or need for different crop growth. Taking a look here at physical properties. Now, part of what the graduate student who worked with Dr. Whipker and myself did is he evaluated the physical properties, the liming requirements, the fertility, the PGR efficacy, among other variables, and we did so using ratios of peat perlite compared to ratios, the same ratios, of peat and pine wood chips. And we did these ratios at 10%, 20%, 30%, and 40%, in some cases 50%, just to really get the full broad spectrum of what are the true comparisons between how does wood react compared to perlite, okay? So for the purpose of this talk and the data I'm going to share with you about some of these parameters, I'm only going to share with you the 20% rate. So an 80-20 peat perlite or an 80-20 pine wood chip substrate are the two substrates we're going to compare, and that this data is going to reflect. So looking at this, this is just one snapshot of the physical properties, and this represents the total porosity. The 100% is the total porosity. And the total porosities of these mixes were still pretty high, ranging up around 86 to 89%. But if you look, the first column is 100% peat. The second column is 20% peat light with perlite in it, and then the last column is with the wood chips. All right, you get statistically there's the same amount of air in the far right column than there is in the middle column, 14 versus 18%. Now numerically, there's it's about a 4% difference, but statistically the same. One of the things that we've seen when mixing wood chips and other wood components and peat is that there tends to be a little more airspace. All right, in this case, statistically not different. When you get a higher percent than 20% wood added to peat, you start to see a little more airspace occurring. This is not really a bad thing. Okay, if you look at the water, the blue lines for both the middle and the far right column, you'll see that the water holding capacity is actually the exact same. So all in all, no differences in physical properties exist for if you take pine wood chips and supplement it with perlite at any rate, 10, 20, 30, 40%, it does not change. So physically, in the amount of water and air we have in our mixes, we can completely substitute perlite with no loss of physical properties. Let's look a little bit at liming requirements. Now, I'm only going to show you the data from a couple of species. Keep in mind, again, this is from a 20% incorporation of perlite versus the pine wood chips, not all the other percentages that we did in the trials. So here you've got shoot dry weight of mums, and the lime rate from 0 up to 12 pounds per cubic yard. At each lime rate, what is significant is, first of all, at each lime weight from 0 all the way up, that the plant growth, the shoot dry weight, was not different between plants grown in perlite versus plants grown in pine wood chips. All right, again, signifying that, all right, plants do not grow smaller or less in wood chips than they do in perlite. But the other key thing here to point out is that the lime rate effect is the exact same. Okay, at 20% incorporation, no additional lime is needed, no less lime is needed. One more slide up for marigolds, kind of illustrating in different species, again, the same trials. In this study, we took it all the way up to 15 pounds per cubic yard just to try to see the ultimate effect of the pH rise. Again, at all at all liming rates, we have the same shoot growth, except at 6-pound rate where actually the plants growing in the PWC, the pine wood chips, were higher. That may be just a result of the porosity, but the take-home message here is that you can expect to not have less growth for crops grown in substrates emitted with wood compared to perlite as it relates to lime. Your liming strategy does not change. This is just a pictorial diagram showing you those plants from the marigold trial, and you would not know the quality difference in any way, shape, or form different between the two mixes. All right, so in conclusion, no difference in lime rate, and that's both pre-plant incorporation for lime or pH modification, or it's for extended pH control during a crop growth. Both of those are very similar for the two aggregates. Okay, so we're very excited about that. Second, paclobutrazol drench efficacy. This is a project really worked closely with Dr. Whipker on. There's been evidence in the past when some of these organic materials are used, pine bark, for example, that they will often bind up some PGRs and either change the rate that needs to be added for the overall growth control, or more is leaching out. So we wanted to see, well, what effect is this pine wood having compared to perlite? So here's some data. Shoot dry weight is what we're reporting here, and we've got from 0 and then 3 different rates of the active ingredient for paclobutrazol. We use sunflowers. Okay, this is one of the plants we use in these trials. All right, so you're looking, you see that the different rates, 10, 20, 30. All right, those are the percent or the ratio of perlite in these mixes. But what you don't see here is the difference between pine wood chips and perlite plants. Well, the reason for that is there was absolutely no difference. So we pooled all the data together, and what we see is that you actually just get the effect of the height control using the PGR as rate increased, but there was no difference between plants grown in the aggregates. All right, so this was the first sign that said, okay, there is no tie-up, there is no change in efficacy or rate needed for plants growing in wood chips, at least for sunflowers. Now, we repeated this with marigolds, we repeated this with plectranthus, and the results were the same. So at least for those 3 crops, there was no difference in any of the paclobutrazol rate that's required. Here's, again, as being a visual person, just wanted to show you what those plants look like. And the variation you see in color but between the plants is more an effect of the lighting at the time of taking those photos than actual green or chlorophyll content of the plants. But overall, the height effect was the same. So again, no differences, and that is regardless of whether it's 10% aggregate or all the way up to 30%. So 30% wood so far, guys, is not changing anything PGR related. It's not changing anything in the liming. It's not changing the physical properties. So we're getting pretty excited at this point. So let's look at nitrogen. We all know that wood ties up nitrogen, right? Well, we did several experiments to look at several species at 3 different rates: 100, 200, and 300 parts per million. Well, again, where's the separation between the plants in pine wood chips and the plants in perlite? Well, we pulled them all together because there was no difference, even at the low rate. So here you see that the 200 rate is optimal for growth, even though all growers don't supply that much nitrogen. But regardless of what rate of nitrogen, plants responded the same. Here's those same plants growing in those 3 different concentrations of nitrogen fertilizers: 100, 200, and 300 parts per million. No difference whatsoever. So 200 is optimal, but regardless of what the rate, the plant growth is the same. So at 30% or less, ladies and gentlemen, the nitrogen is not being tied up. All right, why? Those pine wood particles are so large, they have such little surface area, okay, that nitrogen is not being required to break them down very readily. You get above 30% and you start to change that paradigm and you start to need more fertilizer. Okay, last couple of points here in the next few minutes to finish up. I had a couple of people signed up for today's webinar who asked me proactively, and I put this in, about root growth. And there's been a lot of reports, both by myself and other researchers around the country and other R&D folks at mixed companies, who've reported this root growth benefit. And I have seen this for many years, that regardless of whether it's a herbaceous material in a greenhouse, annuals, perennials, you name it, or whether it's woody plants in small or large containers on a nursery, that there seems to be a proliferation of roots, even in early plant development. And I mean, guys, from plugs to seeds to liners, all the way up from 1-gallon pots being planted into larger 5, 10, 15-gallon pots in the nursery. Those roots seem to explode. Now, one of the hypotheses here is that, well, maybe it's just the physical environment. The wood in the substrate is adding more air, adding more porosity, and maybe that's just the effect. So we recently had a student here at NC State who spent her master's degree kind of trying to quantify, does indeed the incorporation of wood into mixes improve root growth? All right, so in short, yes, it actually does. And why? We were unable to pinpoint exactly, was it just the physical change of the environment that caused all plant material to respond positively to wood components and mixes? Was it a little bit of chemical effect? I think the answer is yes. There are a lot of variables, but without doubt, we see excellent root growth in peat or in bark mixes that contain about 20% wood. Okay, here's one example of perlite versus pine wood chips in growing mums, and this is actually at a 30% aggregate incorporation. 30%, and you can see on the left versus the right. Now, yeah, there's a lot more roots in the root ball of the plant in the pine wood chips compared to the perlite. That was probably a result of not just irrigation, even though these 2 mixes had the same porosity. Okay, there's several things that could explain this, but this is just one example. Another thing I want to point out: this is a mum crop grown for 12, 14 weeks. Look at the pine wood chips in the photo to the right. They don't even change color. They do not even change color. So breakdown, ladies and gentlemen, it's just not a factor. It's not going to happen. They stay that beautiful blonde color consistently. And one of the last things is a little disease survey. Now, this is just some fresh information right off the press that I don't have a whole lot of specifics to give. I'm just sharing with you some of the things that we're doing to continue evaluating wood components. One of the things that we noted in some work by one of our previous students is that with plants growing in mixes that contain wood chips, that there seemed to be a less occurrence, okay, a less likelihood of occurrence of Pythium and Rhizoctonia. So we did some disease trials, and this photo, or this slide, illustrates 4 different photographs of plants growing in these root boxes that we call mini horizotrons, and we're actually testing to see, is it true? Is Pythium actually less likely to occur or less severe in some of the pine wood chips versus perlite? Now here's one little snapshot, and this is not conclusive. Do not write home or put this in the bank. This is just Brian sharing something kind of crazy and cool with you. If you look at the top, this was a snapdragon grown in a mix with 20% wood chips versus just a Fafford 4P, and this isn't anything against Fafford, it's the mix that we had. That's why we just compared it. And this was inoculated with Pythium, and you see the results. All right, actually death and no flowers on the plant in the 4P versus no effect whatsoever in the wood chips. Why? We can talk about that later. There's other possibilities. This is just one experiment out of many that needed to be done before this ever could be concluded. All right, so in the last 2 minutes I want to leave you with a take-home message that, as we all know, peat is not peat is not peat. All right, the bulk of this talk of talking about aggregates and the use of aggregates and mixes. Well, aggregates and the use of perlite is more of a U.S. thing. In Europe, for example, when they have all these different grades and types of peat, as you can see illustrated on the slide, you don't need aggregates. And because you don't need aggregates, perlite isn't a big deal. Well, here in the United States, in the Canadian peat that we get, we're getting peat more looking like the top left-hand corner of this slide. And that requires some type of aggregation to give us the porosity that we want. But it is important, and I've learned this myself over the years, is peat is not peat is not peat. And I'll tell you that wood is not wood is not wood. And if the biggest part of interacting with the industry and interacting with growers and extension agents and other R&D folks at companies and even retail consumers is they think all is the same, okay? And it's not. So I want to really make that point clear is that if you get consistent wood products, you can use them. There's enough body of literature and research that shows you can. But if you switch it and get some other wood source that's not the same, it can have disastrous results, and you can't really rely on them for that matter. So I told you I would end with this slide, and sure enough, I do want to. And here's the take-home message. All right, even with this is about a 30% wood incorporation into this plant mix, but notice it still has perlite. Well, the general public views and thinks perlite is, and you're already thinking it, I know it, I see your brains turning, fertilizer. They think it's fertilizer prills, and as a matter of public perception, those prills need to be there, okay? And so my recommendation is 3, maybe 5%, but 3% perlite in a mix just simply for the aesthetics, even though it does nothing, ladies and gentlemen. It does nothing for the porosity or the physicals of the mix that the wood does not do. So with that, I would be happy to take any questions that you have. Thank you so much.